Chapter 8, where we're talking about GDP, or gross domestic product. So we're now into our specifically macro chapters. So whenever we talk about the macro economy, we're talking about not just one industry or one market or the market for one product, but the market for everything in total. So when we talk about the macro economy, we have three goals. One is economic growth, and we'll talk about economic growth in the short term and long term, high employment, and stable prices. So we want economic growth because this is what leads to a higher standard of living, okay? This means that the people in the society are generally better off, and their standard of living, their way of life is continuing to improve. That's our goal. So if we are the government of a society, that should be our goal, to make the people, to improve the way of life for the people in our society. We measure this through GDP, which is gross domestic product, which is what we're going to talk about in this chapter. Our other two goals are high employment, which is measured through the unemployment rate, and stable prices, which is measured through the inflation rate. And in order to get that, we use CPI, which is Consumer Price Index. So we're going to talk about the next two in the next chapter. In this chapter, we're going to focus on the economic growth and GDP. So when we get into this section, we're going to first talk about how we measure each of these things. And then we'll move, once we understand how they're measured, we'll move on to some of the policy things, fiscal and monetary policy, as they relate to once we know how to measure them, we know what our goals are, then we look at the policies we use to achieve those goals. So some important terms in this one, the business cycle. And so the business cycle, you hear a lot about a recession or the opposite of that is an expansion, which you don't hear about as much. But the business cycle, we look at GDP over time. And we generally see it looking like this. We increase, and then we have a dip, a recession. Then we increase, then we have a dip. We increase like that. So over time, generally GDP is increasing, even though it's not a steady growth. We have periods of declining. And so an expansion is when production, what the economy is producing, is increasing. And generally in these we see employment is high in these times as well. A recession is when production goes down, and generally if firms aren't producing, then they don't need employees, so we see employment go down as well. Economic growth is not necessarily when our production goes up, hopefully it is, but our production capacity goes up. What we're capable of producing goes up. And this will be focused, that's what we mean in the long run. So what we're capable of producing. So this is generally accomplished in a couple different ways. A big one is technology, but we'll talk about, we'll spend a whole chapter talking about that and the policies and the things that need to be in place to achieve that economic growth in the long run. And another thing we talk about is the inflation rate. And so this is the percentage change in prices over time. And what we see is we'll get a little conflict. During a period of expansion, production's going up, employment's going up, but that's also going to drive up prices. So then we have high inflation. When we have a period of a recession, inflation will go down, but unemployment also goes down. So when we talk about these three goals, it's really hard to achieve all three of them, because basically whatever you do to make employment better is going to make inflation worse, and whatever you do to control inflation is going to make employment worse. So they contradict each other. So if everything is cruising along okay, it's not that hard to manage. But when things get out of whack, it's hard to fix one without impacting the others. So the main thing we want to talk about in this chapter is gross domestic product. And I don't normally put a lot of definitions in my PowerPoints, but I'm putting this one in for a couple reasons. There's a couple very important things in here. And gross domestic product is the main thing that we use to measure our our output for the economy. So gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country during a period of time. Typically that'll be a year. Okay, so we'll just go a year. So this means a couple different things. So the market value, not the cost of the inputs, so not the cost to the producer, but what it would sell for. Final goods and services, I'll talk about in a second, and what we mean there is not intermediate goods. What's produced, which is not necessarily what's sold, and then also in a particular period of time. So we're gonna kind of look at these and break it down, and but it's important to know the definition when we look at what's included in GDP and what's not included in GDP. So there are two main ways to look at the total activity in the economy, which is what we're trying to do. Total production or total income. And we are going to focus on total production. Oops. But you should get the same thing either way, okay? And we'll talk about it at the end, but we're going to focus on production. But they should come out the same. And the reason is, if we go back to that circular flow diagram that we talked about, everything that's produced is sold. So everything that gets sold by one company is income for someone, and that's an expenditure for somebody else. So we can look at it by what's sold, or we can look at it by income, because they're all going to be the same thing. You know, what I spend is somebody else's income, so it doesn't matter which side I count it on, I should come out the same. So if we look at the circular flow diagram, okay, we looked at this one before, and it was a circle, and now it's misshapen a little bit. But households provide goods and services, they get paid for it, and then they turn around and spend that money at the firms, okay? We add government in here, and the government takes taxes, right? They take taxes out, but then they turn around and they spend that, and they provide that on services. They take taxes from both groups here, and then they spend it on goods and services. They purchase things from firms and people and all that kind of stuff. So they take the money, but then they turn around and spend it. So that should just be kind of redistributing it in there. We also have the rest of the world, right? So when we buy stuff from other countries, that's an import. And so that takes money out of the system. And when we sell stuff to other countries, we export, and that is money into the system, all right? We import a little more than we export, as you'll see, but it's not that's not a huge part of our economy like it is for other ones, and so it's a little bit negative, but not that much. And then the last one is the financial system. So when households or firms save, that takes money out of the system, but then those, because they're not spending it, but then those banks and stuff turn around and lend that money to other firms, and so they take it out and they put it back in. So it still is a kind of a circular flow. So you can measure it by the income of all these groups, or the expenditures or output of all these groups. So we're going to look at GDP, and the GDP is tracked by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they look at 4 major categories of expenditures. And again, you could look at it by expenditures or by income. Expenditures is a lot easier. There's less components, so we're going to use that one. So the 4 components, and we're going to look at each of these. Consumption, this is essentially household spending, so what we consume, and it'll be broken down in different categories, but overall call that. Investment is mostly business spending, okay? It's also household spending on new homes, but most of the rest of that is business spending. Government purchases, and this would be all governments, but this is government purchases. This is not what we call transfer payments. So a transfer payment is when the government gives you money and you didn't do anything for it. So unemployment benefits, Social Security benefits, any kind of welfare payments. Those are all transfer payments. We're really just transferring it from one group to another. But if you work for the government or you're a government contractor and you're providing goods to the government, then that's government purchases. And then net exports, which is exports minus imports, okay? So exports minus imports. And so for us, we import more than we export, so that number is negative. So you put the two together. Y stands for GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So let's look at each of these components here in a little bit. Consumption is always the biggest component of GDP in our economy. So that is the spending by households on goods and services, not including spending new homes. That goes in the investment thing. So the BEA then divides that into services, durable and non-durable goods. So durable goods are things that are going to last for several years. So cars, appliances, that kind of thing. Non-durable goods would be more like food and things that are going to get used up within a year. And we look at those again when we're looking at economic indicators. We want to go dig down a little bit farther than to just say consumption and look about what's happening with durable and non-durable goods. Generally, durable goods goes down during a recession, and then as we're coming out, it starts to pick back up as people feel a little bit more confident. So that's kind of an indicator that things are changing. The second one is investment. And again, this is spending by firms, by businesses on factories, office buildings, building up inventory, and then also households spending new houses. So they look at it in a couple different things, changes in inventory and all this. But so I mostly think of this as business spending, although it's houses. The other thing is, if a firm is building new factory, office buildings, that kind of stuff, this is mostly spending that you need to borrow to do, all right? So not too many of us have enough cash to put down to buy a new house. Businesses, same thing if they're doing this. So most of this investment spending, these people had to borrow to do this, which means it's going to depend a lot on the interest rate. So that's going to come in and be an important thing later on for us. But the government purchases is the third one. And so this is spending by federal, state, and local government, so all that on goods and services. It does not include transfer payments, since that's not related to the immediate production of something. Okay, we're moving it from one group to another, but it doesn't mean anything new has happened. Nothing has been created or done to create any kind of new production, so we don't count that. So if you receive an unemployment check, that's not part of government spending. But if you work for the government and you get a paycheck, then that is considered part of it. And then net exports is the last part. It could be different. Some countries might have a positive one if they export more than they import. But for us, it's negative and has been negative for quite some time. So this is exports minus imports. Oops. So for us, it's negative. We're counting domestic production. So we add up the value of goods and services sold to foreigners and then subtract the stuff that we do. So we're trying to get what's produced here. There are different definitions, depending on what you're trying to define. It might be if a U.S. company produces it outside the United States, do we want to count that? Or, all these. So there's different ways to define it, but for the export, we just do exports minus imports, and ours is negative. Now, in your book here, they have 2016, I think, was the updated numbers they have there. And I'll show you, I went out to the BEA and got some updated numbers, but the percentages are about the same. And you can see consumption is always the biggest. Investment and government expenditures are usually fairly close. And then net exports is negative, but as you can see, it's pretty small compared to these other ones, which is why it doesn't have a really dramatic impact on ours. And I have a link here to the BEA, where there's a lot of good stuff over there. So I went and got the current numbers for 2019. They had the first half of 2020, but they don't have obviously the full year yet. So the last complete year was 2019, and so you can see it's still 68%. I should have flipped those around, but investment and government spending are about the same. Net exports is a little bit more negative, which means we're importing a little bit more than we're exporting. The other thing I wanted to show you, I ran this. So this is percentage change from one quarter to the next, which is usually how we look at it, just to kind of put things into perspective. So here was the big recession, okay? That people are still talking about, which was very, very severe. And then you could see, during this period here, we had some time that was, we had some pretty significant growth and then some slow periods, but overall it averaged, and then you can see here's where we really started kind of picking back up again. And then here we've had, pretty typical average growth. Some quarters are better than others, but that's pretty typical. And then here's where we are now. And I put this in so you can kind of see in perspective. So this is GDP. So this is what we're producing: the C plus the I plus the G plus the net exports. And this is how far we've contracted, which, just to put it, because this was a very severe recession over here. And you could tell people were talking about it for a really long time, but we came out of that recession, here. We've had, it's been ups and downs, but pretty steady growth from about, from 2014 on, very steady growth. And then the pandemic hit, and you can see this contraction compared to where we are, and that's how far we are down from the previous quarter. Okay, so that's the percentage change from the previous quarter, but it's pretty darn significant. So so that's an important thing for us to be looking at right now. Another way that people calculate GDP is value added, and you'll see this more in like in Europe and that kind of stuff. But I just kind of wanted to briefly explain what this is. And so this is a shirt, okay? And so you take the value of the cotton, and then for the next step, you say the value, now it's worth, once you've run it through the mill, it's now worth $3. So if it's worth $3 and it was worth before, the textile mill added $2 in value. The company that made it into a shirt, by the time it leaves here, it's worth $15, and so this guy added $12. And so in ours, we just kind of count it here, right? We just count it at the total. We don't count all these things because we count final goods and services, and these are what we call intermediate goods. And so in a value added system, you would add it all up like this, whereas we just count it once. The other reason you do this is because each of these groups is kind of taxed on what they added to the process, and so but they should still add up the same. We just kind of calculate it by this. But if you've traveled in Europe and you see a VAT tax, that's what it is, value added tax, and so that's kind of where that one goes.